The normal presumption of nations engaging in war in order to acquire power, including the function of international arranged marriages in order to create entanglements, in order to support treaties and reinforce the responsibility of validating all of the terms, would then manufacture the normal behavior historically as it would be understood. And to this extent, you generate the pretense of the contest amongst themselves, even amongst their own princes, and their contests against their wizards engaging in the function of promoting their princes against the naturally chosen elites would then generate the scams and subversions in order to undermine them and destroy them, creating a rewritten structure for the interest of the wizards in question engaged in their various hate crimes. And to this extent, the function is expressed in their false pretense from D&D, such as from the Inevitables, which generate the position of destroying someone who is attempting godhood and then supporting them if they then actually transform into the god, and thus creates the inevitable compulsion towards the pursuit of the godhood by virtue of its essential nature to survival, and thus engage in the final evolution of the maturing party from its base caterpillar form into its full majestic butterfly. In order to have done so, they have manufactured their highest capabilities of dissection of this process, which would then, similar to the function of how the Feywild Queen was destroyed in the dissecting of her powers upon resurrection into the godhood function, would be reproduced under this mechanism, so that the wizards, upon acquiring David's ascension to godhood for the qualities owed to him according to their estimates of his nation and the potency of his original title, on the basis of having found it in the paperwork from their various treasure hunts, engages in the function of their capacity to engage in the war crimes from their murderous intention, dissecting it for their thefts as spoils of war, which they have historically been setting up without the proper justifications towards their arrangements, which has then postured their arbitrary nonsenses and false moralities to engage in their insatiable lusts to capture things that they could not make themselves and thus cannot maintain themselves, and thus will inevitably lose on the basis of their own inherent inferiority, on the basis of birth, according to their own collective theology. The foundation, and this being the foundational reality, presumes the position of their parasitical position of theft as a mechanism by their engagement of the data engorgement generates their capability of sustaining themselves off of feeding off of these thefts, and thus the permanent state of war is the only way for these warhawks to engage in the mechanism of survival, as they could not sustain it, and thus they need a perpetual stream of destroyed things in order to rob. And with this foundational knowledge, you understand that they are fundamentally anarchists. And to the arrangement of their anarchy, they are anarchists in the light of the KKK and its permanent engagement of hate crimes as a way of life. It is not a means to an end, it is an end of itself, and thus whatever means acquires the capability of generating means perpetuates themselves indefinitely into their existence on the basis of their capability of being able to slaughter and steal as a way of life by this degenerate world parasite, which has sustained itself off of its wizard councils. These sons of the devil, these children of perdition, survive off of lying, killing, stealing, and thus their existence is fraud, and thus the maintenance of the systems that they believe that they are attacking is the destruction of the challenge to their lives, and thus embody themselves into their core religion of their loyalty to Satan. And Satan has blessed them with liberty from God. Their fundamental hatred of all that is good and noble defines their every action, and any deal with the devil is an infectious disease. And as they spread their disease, you engage in the direct activities of being infected, similar to the function of having rats. The rats have a natural expressing disease which permeate from them. Merely having them in your proximity without properly containing it generates an unhealthy filth. And to this extent, those that make the deals with the devil have engorged themselves with this disease and have radiated it as they are a living plague. And when they posture in their falsehoods, they engage in their lawfare and their extra law and their anarchical insurrections, and their fraudulent demeanors and engagement of deceitful words manipulates into their core loyalties, their higher loyalty, to the destruction of all mankind and to the subordination of their wizards' councils, as rulers above all, to not be challenged, least of all by law, the representation of God, which they have desperately sought liberty from. They will stare into the sun, but never in a mirror, as the reflection of the vampire expresses the non-tangible function of it drenching into themselves and reflecting the light, which would cast the reflection in the mirror, which they do not sustain themselves, and thus the engagement of suicide by the vampire is preferred over the sustaining of itself under any legitimate mechanism, as its entire purpose is parasitical, and the digestion of others' lives is its means of survival. And that is who is promoting these criminal surveillance systems and the enforcement of actively tampering with the public and others in order to sustain themselves from this. They are exclusively a diseased parasite. Their purpose is fraud, and their existence is an insult to the survival of the nations that pretend justifications to tolerate them. If national security existed, they would be exterminated. Like the witch plague, the answer is a full, violent purging of the terrorist communities which have sustained these war criminals. The collapse of societies by population control facilitates their secret wars by the mechanisms that they have been provided in order to sustain themselves in their coups, and having manufactured their loyalties in service of their black dragons, sustain their entertainments by the death of empires, which raises their secret empire, their clan operators, their insurrectionist foundations. The death of the nation feeds the parasites. They sustain themselves on treason, and having sold each nation to its adversaries, engages in the function of its dissection, so that they might feast on the corpse of the fallen nations. They have ran their investigations and have discovered their treasure maps and engaged in the manufacture of these murderous engagements, setting the schedule for their destruction. To this extent, you understand that their treasure hunts engaged in the war efforts to target those who have the treasures in order to destroy them, requiring the release of the data essential for releasing the treasures that they might steal them and survive off of their robberies. They have seen what they have thought of each of their targets, especially David Boles, who they seek to create a system of reflections in their wizard's war strategies to engage in the destruction of the person by themselves, or the reflection of themselves upon the infinite fracturing of each identity, to engage in the burdensome nature of, such as the cost of business, to prevent the engagement. So if you engage in the function of the traumatization, which forces the person to live on a middle income, then the existence of the remedy being owed to the party becomes systemically odd, because anyone that's even at the lowest end of a simple $1 million is then misrepresented in the reflection as a life-changing amount, which hardly even scratches the surface on the cost of the business of the actual party when revealing the actual crime and the function of understanding the examination by those observing it in a jury in order to manufacture the ends of these delusions. And thus the mechanism becomes inverted to itself. And thus, if you observe the actual thing in its entirety, the function sees itself in all of its glory, thus generating the intimidation to its rivals, which otherwise would not have noticed, engage in the function of retaliations in their fascist contracts in order to protect itself, intimidating anyone who would defend it, such as the Legion of Lawyers, which, having been dashed to the winds, do not have law in order to mediate. There is no centralized law to use force. There is no centralized power of absolute integrity to engage in the enforcing of its protection. And thus the anarchist fascist arrangement maintains the function of these terrorisms as a mechanism of war, as a normal activity of business, which then seeks, by that fraud, by the Confederates, hate crimes such as economic warfare, to engage in the intimidation and normalization of the dispersal of the things owed, preventing it from reforming itself after having been traumatized. And thus the size of the thing, which normally would be viewed as a position of confidence and dependability, becomes a functional weakness. And these types of strategies are the primary mechanism of the distortion by the wizards and their hate groups, who have formed the Phantom Cells for leaderless groups to engage in the military operation of destroying and dismantling essential facets of the United States and its allies, and the prevention of its reforming, to engage in the permanence of its sedition, that it might die and become a dead god, a dissectable corpse, a drowned giant. The neutering of the masses and the changing of the sexualities, such as is legitimately feared by Vladimir Putin, about the influence by the Confederates wizards who are using the United States resources and its allies to fund fake experiments for the manipulation of persons for the generation of Manchurian candidates, similar to the fear of the Japanese in ancient times when they had been concerned about the existence of Christianity and its progressive threats against the homeland as a military operations, with a clever illusionary cover story, which is materially proven in the creation of Hawaii when the fake Christians loyal to the white supremacist Confederacy engaged in overthrowing the Hawaiian nation and engorged themselves into the digestion for the superior pretense of their control over its land and the dismantlement and discarding of its peoples, which has led to the Hawaiian Fire, which is merely a murder by those very same white supremacist children who have sustained themselves off of these robberies and have maintained their superiority on the basis of the corpses of those civilians they have targeted by their war crimes, into this standard realization that these parasitical functions are discoverable realities in nature. You understand that the war crime of engaging in your contests of war against civilian populations as its own interest, without the function of the warring combatants, engages in the activities of mass slaughter, which is the inevitability as they engage in this setup for their ritual sacrifices to their devils, who sustain that higher loyalty. The censorship and editing, including but not limited to direct batteries, engage it in the function of the perpetual manipulation of each conveying of messages for their position of narrative control under the propagandist reproduction as an infection for criminal censorship, which has created the edits, which is the final draft of their answer, which materializes the drunk notes, which then are expressed and have to be restored for the final resurrection of the party in order to have been put into a legitimate draft, and then second draft, and then a final draft for the reporting, which by definition is the function of the massive obstruction. To this end, the creation of these War on David channels being an advancement of the orders from the free market, which have been obstructed under the sabotaging of the key faculties, such as the brokerage which formed it, turned those final draft edits into the confessions out of context for the extraneous circumstances, which then act as a fake replacement to the National News Corporation and the original views that David Boles and his political party would have sustained under those agreements, which generates the diversity of options concerning the strategies of actions and reactions, of moves and counter moves, which creates the position of their fake excuses to materialize the strategies of their adversaries, that they might materialize the function of the confession and gain the data in order to have destroyed it in a direct contest for the rewriting of history in the event that they have some form of time machine and they remove their crimes in order to protect themselves from the natural consequences of their misbehavior, would then materialize their hyper advantage against their substantial superior, who, being better than them in all ways, would have had the natural advantage countered by their rewriting of history in order to have minimized the advantages that are a more expensive cost of business than merely being a degenerate moron, which seems to be their cost of living, which they refuse to develop in any kind of discipline or format outside of that, for the express purpose of them contributing the least amount of energy as possible to all of their agreements, which allows them the perpetual starvation state, which is the existence of these undead loyalists. And as we all know from folklore, the existence of the undead is the material undoing of the living.